Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome back. We are so excited to see you all and to have our first in-person event at the Cushwa Center since late February 2020. We've been very busy on Zoom. I know we've seen a lot of you on Zoom, but there's nothing to replace seeing each other in person. And we're so excited that it is this event, our seminar in American religion, that marks our return to in-person gatherings. My name is Kathy Cummings. I direct the Cushwa Center for the Study of Catholicism at Notre Dame. I'm also a professor in the Notre Dame's Departments of American Studies and History. And again, you're all very welcome, particularly those who are attending for the first time. I also want to give a special warm welcome to doctoral students in the audience. There was a time that seems like only yesterday that our distinguished author and me and Darren and Tim and all of us were in your shoes attending the seminar in American religion as doctoral students at Notre Dame. So we're very, very grateful, particularly for your presence. The seminar in American religion has been meeting for over 4 decades now, twice each year, to provide scholars of North American religion and other interested scholars an opportunity to discuss a recent notable book published in the field. The topic of today's seminar, of course, is Kristin Dumay's book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, published in 2020 by Liveright. As you all know, we have postponed this event. We postponed this event a year ago in favor of waiting until time we could all meet again in person. We have had many influential books featured in the seminar in American religion. I don't think we've ever had a book that has been on the New York Times bestseller list. This book has been described to me as the most depressing book people have ever written, but again, an important book. Many of the books we featured have changed the field, but I think this one, the process of changing the field and the conversation is happening. It just happened almost instantly upon publication, whereas many of our books have taken longer to do that. So we're just, and it is also a work of very distinguished scholarship, and it's an incredible achievement and well worth the wait to come here and discuss it in person. So I'll just introduce briefly our distinguished author and our featured panelist. So Kristin Dumay is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University, and she received her PhD at the University of Notre Dame. Prior to joining Calvin, Kristin taught at Williams College and worked at Five College Women's Studies Research Center. She specializes, sounds superfluous to say, but in the intersection of gender, religion, and politics in recent American history. She's a very prolific author whose work has appeared in both academic and popular publications. Her previous book, A New Gospel for Women, Catherine Bushnell and the Challenge of Christian Feminism, was published with Oxford in 2015. That book examined its titular figure's life and work and comes away with insights for modern Christian feminists. She's been a contributor to Religion and American Culture, Fides et Historia, and to the recent volume, Evangelicals, Who Have They Been, Are Now, and Could Be, edited by Mark Knoll, David Bebbington, and George Marsden. She's been published in the Daily Beast, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and most recently explored American evangelicalism's connections to forms of masculinity and historiography. Her forthcoming book, Live, Laugh, Love, amazing title, published by Liveright, will examine relationships between white Christian womanhood and consumer culture. So stay tuned for that. Beyond her publications, Kristin is a much sought-after speaker and has been interviewed for multiple national news outlets and podcasts. Kristin has noted in her acknowledgments that she is no stranger to Notre Dame even after she finished her PhD. She thanks Cora and the seminar, the conference Enduring Trends and New Directions, which was held in honor of Mark Knoll, for helping influence this book. So Kristin, we're absolutely delighted to welcome you back to campus. Thanks for being here. We're delighted to have 2 excellent commentators to get our discussion started this morning, Professors Emily Remus and Matthew Avery Sutton. My colleague Emily is an associate professor of history at Notre Dame, and she is also concurrent faculty for the Gender Studies program. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago, and her research examines gender history and the history of capitalism with a focus on the urban environments of the Gilded Age and Progressive era in American society. Before teaching at Notre Dame, Emily was a visiting scholar at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her writing has also been featured in numerous publications, from American Historian Magazine to the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Urban History. Her article, Tippling Ladies and the Making of Consumer Culture. We're killing it on titles this morning, I have to say. Gender and Public Space in Fin de Siècle, Chicago appeared in the Journal of American History, and in 2015 received the official Calhoun Article Prize from the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Emily's 2019 book, A Shopper's Paradise, How the Ladies of Chicago Claimed Power and Pleasure in the New Downtown, published by Harvard University Press, explored how downtown Chicago came to welcome women's commerce at the turn of the 20th century. Emily is presently working on a social and cultural history of women in consumer credit with support from the American Council of Learned Societies. Welcome, Emily. Thank you so much for being with us today. Matthew Avery Sutton is the Edward R. Meyer Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of History at Washington State University. He received his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Matt's research and teaching concerned the cultural and religious history of the United States during the 20th century. Matt has taught at Oakland University and numerous European institutions. He held the Mary Ball Washington Chair in American History at University College Dublin with support from the Fulbright U.S. Scholars Program. He's been a visiting professor and scholar in residence at Heidelberg University and most recently visiting professor at the University of Tübingen. Matt's 2007 book, Amy Semple McPherson and the Resurrection of Christian America, won Harvard University Press's Thomas J. Wilson Memorial Prize and served as the basis for the documentary Sister Amy, part of WGBH's series, The American Experience. The American Library Association named his book American Apocalypse, A History of Modern Evangelicalism as a Choice Outstanding Academic Title of 2015. His most recent book, published in 2019, is another great title, Double Crossed, The Missionaries Who Spied for the United States During the Second World War. That appeared with Basic. He is currently working on 2 book projects, a volume co-authored with Kate Cartier entitled One Nation, Divisible, A History of the American People, forthcoming in 2022, and another expected in 2025 called Fighting for the Soul of America, Christianity in the United States, from Colonial Times to the Trump Era. Will be published with Basic. Matt is a former Guggenheim Foundation Fellow and a recipient of an NEH Fellowship, as well as the NEH's Public Scholar Fellowship. And he serves as co-editor of the journal Religion and American Culture, and formerly was part of the editorial board for Pacific Historical Review. Thanks for being with us, Matt. I'm delighted to have you here. A quick word and a reminder for returners on our format. We're going to hear from each of our commentators first, and then Kristin will have an opportunity to respond to some of their questions. After a coffee break, we'll reconvene and open the floor for a general discussion. So with that, please join me in welcoming our first commentator, Matt Sutton.
Emily.
Oh, Emily. We just worked this out. Our first commentator, Emily Remus.
Good morning. So it's such a pleasure to be here in person, finally. This is my first real in-person event since 2020. I trust it is many of our first in-person events since 2020. It's an even greater pleasure that we're here for the purpose of discussing Kristin's wonderful book. I'm grateful to everyone at the Cushwa Center for their work organizing this event. And of course, I'm especially grateful to Kathy for the invitation to reflect on Kristin's work. So I must confess at the outset that I was initially surprised that Kathy thought of me for this opportunity, and I accepted with some trepidation. As Kathy's introduction has no doubt made clear, I am no scholar of American religion. I admire my many Notre Dame colleagues and graduate students who specialize in this field, but I write and teach almost exclusively about the secular, not the sacred. And so I worried I might be out of my depth. But upon diving into Kristin's book, I quickly recognized that I was swimming in familiar waters. In addition to the history of religion, Kristin's work critically engages the history of gender and consumer culture, 2 areas where I feel much more at home. Instead, then, of trying to pass myself off as a second-rate historian of religion, I will focus today on the issues I know best and leave the religious history to the many experts in this room. I'll start by speaking about gender and then pivot to think more about consumer culture. So Jesus and John Wayne, as I'm sure we are now no doubt aware, offers a compelling account of how 81% of white evangelicals could vote for a man whose moral character drifted so far from the values they espouse. At the center of Kristin's explanation is gender. She argues that evangelical support for Trump was no pragmatic choice, but rather an affirmation and culmination of an ideology of militant masculinity that has been developing since the Cold War. This ideology, in Kristin's words, enshrines patriarchal authority and condones the callous display of power at home and abroad. It's evangelical commitment to this ideology that not only explains their support for Trump, but also gives coherence to other beliefs, from enthusiasm for excessive use of force to opposition to immigration, gay rights, and gun control. Kristin's analysis takes gender seriously as an ideology, an explanatory framework, and a mover of history. Constructs of manhood, she suggests, are not peripheral or incidental, but absolutely critical to understanding evangelical choices and the trajectory of the last half-century. Here, the influence of our own Gail Biederman is quite plain. It was striking to me that the rough-riding, big-stick-carrying Teddy Roosevelt pops up at several points throughout the text. As Gail first demonstrated in her field-defining work, Manliness and Civilization, Roosevelt's aggressive persona, imperial aspirations, and emphasis on the strenuous life provided touchstones for middle-class white men adjusting to economic and cultural change in the early 20th century. Echoes of TR's model of manhood are certainly evident in the militant masculinity Kristin details, making him a sort of spiritual grandfather of John Wayne. But I think Gail's influence reaches beyond the specter of Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, in processing my thoughts on Kristin's book, I actually returned to Gail's work. In her first chapter, Gail cautions against assuming, even in moments of extensive change, that masculinity could ever be in crisis. To do so, she explains, would be to suggest that manhood is a trans-historical category or fixed essence that has its good moments as well as its bad. Instead, we must recognize manhood as a continual dynamic process through which men claim certain kinds of authority. In Jesus and John Wayne, Kristin too carefully resists the notion of crisis, even as she shows that evangelical men were motivated by and stoking a sense of embattlement. The book's subjects are not trying to restore some lost version of masculinity to make manhood great again, so to speak. Instead, Kristin shows the dynamism of masculine constructs, their slipperiness and plasticity. We see how evangelicals were continually revising and remaking manhood in order to shore up their own authority. It's for that reason the abrupt shift from the family-oriented emotionalism of the Promise Keepers to the gun-toting martial arts practicing warrior heroes of the post-9/11 era does not induce whiplash, but rather fits into a coherent trajectory. Kristin demonstrates that power, not particular beliefs or constructs, mattered most. If we move even further back up the chain of inspiration and influence, we can see that Kristin's work, like Gail's before her, was shaped by Joan Scott, who worked with Gail at Brown. In the 1980s, Scott famously advocated for gender as a category of analysis. She urged historians to consider how language operated to construct difference between the sexes and establish relationships of power. Scott's approach pushed feminist scholarship in new directions, and Kristin picks up her mantle in analyzing the vast discursive output of evangelical thinkers in books, radio programming, seminars, and more. But not all feminist historians, then or now, heeded Scott's call to foreground language and signs. In a classic roundtable exchange from 1987, Christine Stansel, a pioneer in the field of U.S. women's history, raised concerns about making Scott's discursive approach the reflexive mode for understanding gender. As Stansel wrote at the time, it is ultimately the activities of real women which press gender into the service of rhetoric. By turning our gaze away from what Stansel described as the grubby social analysis to focus on the realm of language, historians could, Stansel feared, push women and their lived experiences right out of gender history. I am sympathetic to both sides of this debate, but it came freshly to mind as I reflected on Kristin's book. In Jesus and John Wayne, we encounter gender principally as it is constructed through the words of male evangelicals. We do, of course, hear from a few women, such as Maribel Morgan, Beverly LaHaye, and practicing Catholic Phyllis Schlafly. But the experiences of ordinary women, the evangelical wives, moms, and daughters who shopped at Hobby Lobby, took purity pledges, and devoured Total Woman, are largely absent. How did these women, one wonders, shape, facilitate, resist, or understand the changes happening in their marriages, families, churches, and political culture? We get a glimmer of an answer in the final chapter, which speaks to women's experiences of abuse. Here, Kristin offers an eye-opening account of how female victims were caught between a rock and a hard place, between defying patriarchal authority and submitting to abuse. This window into how evangelical women encountered militant masculinity made me hungry for more. What could a grubby social analysis of the women linked to militant men reveal? What do we gain by moving beyond discourse to consider lived experience? To be clear, I am not asking Kristin for a different book. The book she has written already accomplished so much. Instead, I am pointing to questions and spaces that Jesus and John Wayne opens for exploration. One of these questions, to my mind, is if evangelical men and women shared an understanding of their support for Trump. It seems notable to me that after the Access Hollywood tape came to light, the only true evangelical critics were women. And so while evangelical men and women may both have voted for Trump, I wonder if their vote meant the same thing. Were women more likely to be holding their nose, so to speak, while men saw their vote as a positive affirmation of qualities they appreciated in Trump? Perhaps not. But digging deeper into evangelical women's expectations and experiences of militant masculinity might shed some light on this and other questions. It would also recenter women in a story of evangelical gender relations. I will turn now, as promised, to consumer culture. In Jesus and John Wayne, Kristin takes consumer culture as seriously as gender. In fact, it is consumer culture on which her definition of evangelical hinges. Instead of distinguishing between real and supposed evangelicals, it is more useful, Kristin argues, to consider the degree to which they participated in an evangelical culture of consumption. In this, she is elaborating and updating George Marsden's suggestion that an evangelical was anyone who liked Billy Graham. Her emphasis on consumer culture allows Kristin to show that supposed fringe characters were actually not that fringe at all. Indeed, the output of loud extremists shaped broader evangelical culture, and as a result, the distance between the margins and the mainstream was for most evangelical consumers easily traversed. As Kristin reminds us when detailing the content of evangelical books, seminars, and media programs, the products Christians consume shape the faith they inhabit. Yet it strikes me that not all products are consumed in the same way by every person. Here, I am reminded of Lisbeth Cohen's analysis in her first and now quite classic monograph, Making a New Deal. Cohen shows that working-class white ethnics assigned different meanings to consumer products than those intended by advertisers, retailers, and national brands. Instead of buying into a homogenized national consumer identity concocted on Madison Avenue, white ethnics, at least initially, subverted expectations and participated in consumer culture in a way that reaffirmed their distinctive ethnic roots. My objective in pointing this out is not to summarize Cohen's contributions. Rather, I want to call attention to a thorny issue with which historians of consumer culture have long had to grapple. Consumers do not always consume the way producers expect or desire. To quote Cohen, consumption involves the meeting of two worlds, the buyers and the sellers, with buyers bringing their own values to every exchange. Kristin beautifully illuminates the content of evangelical consumer products, but we know less about their reception, about how consumers interpreted and applied that content. On the most superficial scale, I think of the wife who, after reading Total Woman, interpreted Morgan's advice as an invitation to greet her husband in nothing but saran wrap. This particular greeting was not something Morgan had herself suggested, but was instead a creative application of her text. Of course, this is a trivial example involving a popular rumor, but the question... I'm sorry, I thought someone said something about the microphone. conjured that in my brain.
We heard saran wrap in our minds.
A creative application of the voices in my head, apparently. Of course, this is a trivial example involving a popular rumor, but the question of reception is not itself trivial. Simply because a message was communicated does not mean it was received, or that it was received in the manner which the originator intended. Getting at reception is not easy or straightforward, but certainly there is more we can learn by digging into how evangelicals understood and applied the content they were absorbing. The question of reception seems potentially quite significant when considering, for example, the generational tensions at which Jesus and John Wayne hints. The Obama years were especially fraught in this regard, as evangelicals watched, in Kristin's words, their once powerful megachurches diminish in size and influence, with many of their own children leading the ways out the doors. When contemplating this generational divide, it is difficult to overlook that the key touchstones of militant manhood are not exactly youthful figures. John Wayne, Ronald Reagan, and Mel Gibson's William Wallace might all evoke certain feelings among men of a certain age. But it's hard to imagine college kids or high schoolers embracing them unironically. Even Duck Dynasty and 19 Kids and Counting are now cultural relics. I am not suggesting that these figures or products do not matter. Kristin has shown convincingly that they do. Rather, I am querying whether they have the same meaning and explanatory power for a new generation of evangelicals. Any answer, it seems to me, must take into account how consumption itself has changed in recent years. Young people are now swimming in an endless sea of content, fueled by the rise of social media and streaming platforms. They no longer walk into Walmart or Christian booksellers to buy the latest evangelical consumer product. Rather, they encounter it on their phones or tablets. There, Facebook algorithms might amplify evangelical messages, but these devices are also introducing new messages and cultural models. Young evangelicals today can opt into secular consumer culture more easily and discreetly than their parents or grandparents could. If faith is shaped by products consumed, what does the future hold for militant manhood? In light of the dynamism and flexibility Kristin has shown evangelical gender constructs to possess, it seems unlikely that militant masculinity will disappear, even if reverence for John Wayne does. The question we're left with then is, what does evangelical masculinity look like in the age of TikTok? I hope future scholars will take up this question, inspired by Kristin's wonderful work.
Good morning. Let me begin by thanking Kathy for having me out, and the Cushwa Center and Madonna, there you are, Madonna, for making everything so smooth. And also to Kristin for writing this wonderful book. It's been fun. It was fun to read when I read it, and then to have to wait 2 years to come and talk about it. So it's given me plenty of time to think about it. I want to open by listing 3 grievances I have with Kristin and with the book. I thought this would be an appropriate place to begin. September 2018. I had to look up the month because I didn't really remember it, but for those of you who don't remember what you were doing in September of 2018, along with me, you were probably watching the Brett Kavanaugh hearings before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. I was watching and I was outraged. And what I could sense at the time, and what Kristin ends up writing about, is that about half of white evangelicals thought that Kavanaugh should be confirmed, even if what he was accused of was true. So I was watching this unfold in kind of shock and horror, and I just decided I need to write a book about this. I need to explain why white evangelicals are so doggedly supportive of Donald Trump. I wrote a 25-page book proposal. I went onto Amazon and filled my shopping cart with every journalistic expose of Trump and every book by a religious leader writing about Trump. Luckily, I didn't hit purchase. Then I went and started talking to editors and said, I want to write this book. I'm angry. And I knew it was going to be like something I'd have to write in 6 months because nobody would want to read it well after Trump was out of office. And one of the editors I talked to was at Liveright. And he said, no, it's an interesting topic, but we already have a book coming that deals with evangelicals and Trump. So my first grievance is not really a grievance. It's a thank you to Kristin for saving me from having to hit purchase on that Amazon shopping cart and not having to spend 6 months immersed in Donald Trump's world. My second grievance. Let me read you a line from page 203 from Jesus and John Wayne. Given the audacity of Doug Wilson's claims, Doug Wilson is one of the featured characters in the book if you haven't read it, his geographic isolation, and his preference for building his own empire on his own terms, it would be right to place him on the very fringes of American evangelicalism. So think about that sentence. Why do we put Doug Wilson on the fringes of American evangelicalism? Because of his geographic isolation. I don't know Doug Wilson's home address, but it is less than 10 miles from my home address. So apparently that puts me on the fringes of the profession as well, due to my geographic isolation. And then finally, and Emily more masterfully dealt with this, but the title, Jesus and John Wayne, when I first learned of the book, knew it was coming, I didn't like the title, and I still don't like the title, but I'm happy to admit that I'm clearly wrong, that many hundreds of thousands of people like the title. So Kristin was right and I was wrong. But it is interesting to think about the generation that speaks to in what we're saying with Jesus and John Wayne, because for me it would have been Jesus and Mel Gibson, as Emily mentioned. It would have been Jesus and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Like for me growing up in the 90s, or not coming of age in the 90s, not growing up in the 90s, but those were the kind of masculine role models I thought about. John Wayne was already old and dead at that point, in my mind. But clearly, there was a larger cult of John Wayne than I was, or even really to this day still am aware of. And it's fascinating just to see how this book has resonated in so many ways with so many people. I'm going to shift now and talk a little bit about the book and what I think Kristin was trying to do with it, and then I'll raise some questions and topics that I think might be worth exploring further for all of us together, and some questions hopefully Kristin can answer. But so Dumais' brilliant and engaging Jesus and John Wayne, as most of you probably know, traces how evangelicals used their power to protect patriarchy over the last few generations. And she begins her story with Billy Graham. We have to start all books on evangelicalism with Billy Graham, and we should. Evangelicals under Graham's leadership, Kristin argues, quote, believed they had a special role to play in keeping America Christian, American families strong, and the nation secure. The assertion of masculine power would accomplish all of these goals. And I think that line really sets up what Kristin was trying to do in this book. There's three pieces here. Keep America Christian. To do that, you keep American families strong. And to do that, you need masculine power. You need an assertion of patriarchy. So then Kristin, throughout the rest of the book, shows how this played out, how it unfolded over 6 decades, roughly. So you have Billy Graham in the 50s and 60s. Then she shifts to the rise of second-wave feminism and the way evangelicals responded to second-wave feminism in the 1970s. In Maribel Morgan, I already crossed out my line about saran wrap here since Emily beat me to it. But what evangelicals were doing were creating an alternative, explicitly thinking about here's what feminism is doing. We can't just ignore this, so we're going to do something different. And the way they did it was through publications, through seminars, through Bible studies, through meetings. A few years later, they realized they were falling behind on sex with the sexual revolution, so they began writing Christian sex manuals. And these vary in terms of their explicitness and not their explicitness, what they promote, what they discourage. If you haven't read them, I find them endlessly entertaining, which probably tells you more about me than them. But what we see here with sex manuals and books like The Total Woman is the rise of an alternative culture that mirrors what's happening in the secular culture, but is different from it. And I think we have the roots, the seeds of this different evangelical culture here. And then that's going to get blown up a few years later with the rise of contemporary Christian music and the idea that you now have rock and roll, but it's Christian rock and roll. So again, there's this juxtaposition of whatever the secular world is doing, evangelicals are trying to do better, and they're, in doing so, creating an entirely different world for themselves. Then we jump to the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan, which Kristin, I loved this line, talks about him being elected over the, quote, masculinity challenged Jimmy Carter. It's a little bit of a shot at Jimmy.
Just read it.
Okay. But obviously, Ronald Reagan dresses like a cowboy. He was perfectly cast, as Kristin says, for his role as a hero of the religious right, and of course he was. Then in the 1990s, there's this kind of rethinking among evangelicals about who they wanted to be, what they wanted to do, what their masculinity meant. And with that, we see the rise of Promise Keepers, which balances like football and kind of quote-unquote traditional masculine sport with bro hugs, with tears, with men who want to take responsibility for being good husbands and good fathers, and good as they define it. That doesn't last for long, though, because of 9/11. These attacks re-inspire another pivot among evangelicals. They get rid of, or they abandon, the soft patriarchy of Promise Keepers and instead resurrect the idea of Jesus as a militant warrior and then evangelical men as militant warriors. Then we get to the Obama years, and at that point, pundits begin talking about the end of white Christian America. Evangelicals then turn to Donald Trump. And this is where Kristin sort of ties all these things together and writes, quote, "For nearly 50 years, evangelicals were looking for a protector, an aggressive, heroic, manly man, someone who wasn't restrained by political correctness or feminine virtues, someone who would break the rules for the right cause. And so Trump satisfied their lust for a new prophet by vowing to lead them out of the secular wilderness. He became their ultimate fighting champion." So by Kristin's account, the Jesus at the center of evangelicals' lives is not the peacemaker of the Gospels, but the vengeful warrior Christ. So that's how I sort of see the summary, the overview. So now here are the questions. Here are the issues that this raised for me as I was reading it and as I've been thinking about it. First, the million-dollar question that this room would be an ideal place for us to talk about is, what is an evangelical? How do we define that? And I have some questions with Kristin's definition, and I do this in kind of I want to acknowledge that it's crappy of me to ask these questions to kind of poke holes, because she gave us 200 and some pages to answer this question, and I don't have a better answer. I just am not entirely satisfied with her answer. So again, I ask these questions with a sense of humility that I don't know what an evangelical is. But Kristin says an evangelical is not someone who accepts the Bevington quadrilateral. And I'm sorry for those of you who have no idea what that is. Don't worry about it. But I absolutely agree. Kristin's absolutely right. That old definition of evangelicalism just doesn't work. And there's all kinds of reasons why we know it doesn't work. But if that doesn't define evangelicalism, what does? And she tells us it's not theology. So in earlier generations, there might have been debates about whether or not you should have infant baptism or believer's baptism, and that would cause schisms. You might have debates about whether or not the gifts of the Holy Spirit are still present today, healing, speaking in tongues, etc. That would cause division. You might have debates over whether or not we all can choose our own salvation, or only some of us are predestined for salvation. That would cause schisms. But within evangelicalism, theology doesn't seem all that important, that they put aside all of these kinds of things to come together in this shared culture. So what is it that ties them together? What is it that unites them? Kristin says that despite evangelicals' frequent claims that the Bible is the source of their social and political commitments, evangelicalism must be seen as a cultural and political movement rather than a community defined chiefly by its theology. So cultural and political movement. What defines that culture? It's a culture of consumption, and Emily laid out how important that is and how much we can learn about this culture of consumption in defining evangelicals. So when Kristin explains it in the book, she says an evangelical essentially is someone who buys their kids' VeggieTale videos, listens to contemporary Christian music, reads fiction by Beverly Lewis. It's the people who go into different Christian bookstores and buy their products, whether they're Baptists or independents or go to suburban megachurches, that it's this consumption that creates evangelicalism. At dinner last night, Darren Dochuk asked me to give my testimony, and he was being sarcastic, but I will give you one piece of my testimony. In the late 1990s, I managed family Christian bookstores. I managed 4 different stores and almost took a job as a book buyer and would have moved to beautiful Grand Rapids to be a corporate buyer for family Christian stores. I ended up deciding to go back to grad school, and I'm glad my life took a different trajectory because family Christian stores no longer exists. But there's other reasons why I'm glad I went back to grad school. But I was in this world. I understood this world. I was selling this stuff. I was encouraging this culture of consumption. And there was a ton of patriarchy in the stuff people were consuming, but it wasn't all patriarchy. There was a lot of other kinds of things going on as well. Part of it's generational. The Christian music. We can find examples of kind of horrific patriarchy in contemporary Christian music, but there's also a lot of young people that aren't concerned with the same kinds of issues of the John Wayne generation. So I'm still left asking, if evangelicalism is a consumer culture, how do we know? Like, is the stuff they're buying really promoting patriarchy? And I'm just not sure. A few other questions I had. I was surprised by, in kind of rereading the book in the last couple of weeks, surprised by Kristin's lack of attention to abortion. And again, it's not that she should have written a different book or another book or added another 100 pages, but abortion is woven throughout the book. Like, if you look at the index, there are multiple references to abortion in the rise of the pro-life movement. But it seems to me a book that's going to center on patriarchy could really explain as well why evangelicals became so dogmatically pro-life, why that became such an essence to their faith, an essential part of who they were. Because I've never been satisfied with the explanations I've seen as to why that became such a decisive issue for evangelicalism and the religious right. And I think still is today, right, when you get the polls of what issues motivate evangelicals to vote Republican, often abortion is one of the highest ones. So I would love to have seen more, or hopefully we can talk more, about how this rise of militant patriarchy corresponds with the rise of the pro-life movement, and what is the relationship between these two things. Kristin does a wonderful job talking about race and acknowledging that when we talk about evangelicals, we're really talking about white folks, and that their race is central to their identity, that you can't understand evangelicalism without understanding race. But I was curious, there's another issue that Kristin evaded that's been bothering me for years, and maybe you can answer this question. But the relationship between race and abortion, and this ties back to my previous comments. Many of you know, if you read anything Randall Balmer, and I love Randy, but anything he's written in the last 20 years, he will always say the religious right was founded in reaction to Brown versus Board of Education, because he got Paul Weyrich, who says at one point it was desegregation that inspired Jerry Falwell and all these Southern fundamentalists and evangelicals to organize the religious right. And I don't necessarily buy that. Not that they weren't racist, not that they didn't want to keep segregated schools, but I think there's more going on here than that. But Balmer's argument is starting to gain steam. It was reiterated recently by Sarah Posner's new book, Unholy, by Anthea Butler's wonderful book on evangelical racism. But I'm just not convinced that race is the kind of central explanation for the rise of the religious right. And in this sense, I think Kristin's book really helps us better understand why these things predate Brown v. Board, or at least the IRS going after Bob Jones University in the 1970s. One of the things that I thought was really helpful that Kristin does is talk about the centrality of this myth of Christian America in understanding race. And so she says that evangelicals perceive the United States as always having been a Christian nation, and that it could be and should be again. And this is why they oppose the civil rights movement. Because if you acknowledge America's long history of racism, then it's hard to say this was a Christian nation but had this kind of huge original sin. And one of the things that was really helpful about that explanation for me was it helped explain Jeremiah Wright in the anger over his "goddamn America" phrase that dogged Barack Obama. Because I couldn't understand why people were so upset, why evangelicals were so upset about the "goddamn America" phrase, because it seemed like something any white evangelical might preach sooner or later, like that the nation has sins and that God might condemn the nation for its sins, whether it's gay rights, whether it's abortion. Like, you can list the number of sins that evangelicals would identify and say God might damn America. But that he said it about racism just got people obviously all bent out of shape. And I think Kristin helps us understand why that is. I lost my place in my notes. So another question I have, or hope we can discuss today, is the theology of white Christian nationalism that evangelicals promote. Kristin doesn't spend much time on theology, and I think that's fine, but I like theology. I would like to talk about theology. And one of the things I've found in my studies of evangelicalism is even if theology is not what's driving their politics, is not what's driving their culture, they will come up with theological justifications for what they do. It may be after the fact, but they still do it. But I haven't yet seen evangelicals justify Christian nationalism, to explain how they go from members of the universal body of Christ to America first. How they go from believing in a Jesus who was willing to sacrifice himself and allow himself to be subjected to his enemies, to these militant warriors who are going to fight for their rights, who are going to go to battle, who are going to be these warrior Christians. So I'm guessing that they must like these guys that you talk about, they must explain this. They must have some way to rationalize this, but I just don't know what it is, and I would love to know more. Kristin also talks about, and Emily alluded to this question of abuse and the relationship between sexual abuse within evangelical churches and whether or not that is linked to their patriarchy, to their evangelical theology. So again, Kristin writes, the frequency of these instances and the tendency of evangelicals to diminish or dismiss cases of abuse in their own communities suggests that evangelicals' response to allegations of abuse in the era of Trump cannot be explained by political expediency alone. Rather, these tendencies appear to be endemic to the movement itself. I'm not sure. It may be that is the case. And there was a recent article in Vice exposing Doug Wilson, this church, this movement near me, near where I live, with kind of a horrible history of abuse, sexual abuse, marital rape, and kind of this idea that women need to just submit to their husbands and take this horrific stuff. But I'm not sure if correlation is causation, right? We know abuse happens in all kinds of churches, in all kinds of theologies, and all kinds of different religious systems. And I just don't know. I think Doug Wilson is an asshole, and abuse happens in his church, but I don't know if the abuse happens because he's an asshole. Like, I don't know if there's what the correlation is there. So this is where, if any of you are aspiring sociologists in the room, I would love to see the data on that. I would love to see more exploration of the relationship between patriarchal theology and abuse. Finally, I'll turn to Trump. Well, not finally. One of my last points, almost finally. The book turns to Trump, and I really enjoyed Kristin's explanation because I've been wrestling with where Trump came from. But Kristin talks about Trump as the logical culmination of all of these years of evangelical patriarchy and evangelical militant masculinity. Basically, that it was inevitable that evangelicals would embrace Trump. I didn't see it as inevitable. In 2016, I thought he had a chance at winning, but having studied the religious right, having studied evangelicals, I thought they would see past him. I thought they would realize he was a con man, realize he was a charlatan, realize he, in his personal life, was the antithesis to so many of their values. And my parents are good church-going evangelicals who voted Republican for my entire life. Both of them saw past Trump. Neither of them voted for him in 2016. And I thought this is what the rest of white evangelicalism is going to do as well. Kristin says that we should have expected evangelicals to vote for Trump. And I'm also hoping we can think about and discuss how many of you expected that. Was I the idiot, the naive one who didn't see this coming? Or was this surprising? Was this a new stage in evangelicals' politics and what evangelicals try to represent? And then final two things that I really am going to finish up here. I hope we can talk about style. For those of you who haven't read Kristin's book, she has a very engaging style. In some of her chapter titles, I'll quote them for you. John Wayne Will Save Your Ass, Holy Balls, and Spiritual Badasses. I love all these titles. But I've also found when I've used words like those in my books, I get hit for it on Goodreads or on Amazon, and people are horrified by my bad language and my talking about sex. And usually I'm quoting letters about sex. I'm not talking about sex, but I'm curious if Kristin can talk a little bit about those decisions, and if she had the decision to make again today, would she make those same decisions? Like what are the strengths and the weaknesses of those kinds of choices? And then finally, audience. I hope Kristin will talk about who she was intending to write this book for, and if that, in fact, is the audience that has embraced this book. Because if you don't follow Kristin on Twitter, you should. This book has really resonated with, I think, evangelical women seems to be the main buyers of it.
It's pretty evenly split, men and women.
Okay. But evangelicals, obviously academics love it, but there are 1,000 academics who will buy a book on evangelicalism. There are multiple hundreds of thousands of evangelical men and women who are eager to read this book and understand it. And I'm thinking about, would this book have had the impact it's had without Twitter? And I hate Twitter, but I can't bring myself to delete my account. But this may be one of the ways where we can see that Twitter actually does serve a good function, that this book is not in the Christian bookstores. So how are these evangelical men and women finding out about it? They're probably finding out about it through social media, would be my guess. And then, of course, it snowballs, and then they start hearing about it in their churches and on podcasts and their friends and all the things Kristin is doing now for it. But I just wonder if Twitter is the foundation of that, and if we can at least for 1 minute be grateful to Twitter for doing one thing good for our culture. So, Anyway, I love the book. Thank you, Kristin, for writing it, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of you on it.
Oh, well, thank you, Emily and Matt. Thank you, Kathy, for pulling this together, and Madonna also, and all of those who have made this possible for us to be here in person. It really is quite thrilling. I'm going to open with a little personal story. I'm still a little disoriented because this isn't the McKenna Hall I know and love. My first attendance at the seminar was when I was an undergraduate student still at Dort College. I had just been newly admitted into the PhD program here, and on my campus visit, I had the privilege of hearing John McGreevy present at this event on his parish boundaries. And I was incredibly intimidated to be in a room with that many people asking really tough questions and then applauding at the end, saying that was a great book. And I thought, what have I gotten myself into? And I absolutely loved it too. So it's just an honor to be back here in this space, even if it does look a little bit different. And Emily was absolutely correct to point to the formative influence of Gail Biederman's work. I came here to Notre Dame to study religious and intellectual history because that was the history that really mattered. And in that first semester, Gail Biederman dropped into our pro seminar and introduced me to the field of gender. And that week, I changed my focus. And so I think that Jesus and John Wayne very clearly reflects my work here at Notre Dame and my essentially two advisors, George Marsden and Gail Biederman. And this is the result of that match. So let's see. Yes, it was Biederman's work that sparked this book in an indirect way, or actually quite direct way. If you have the paperback edition, there's a story in the preface where I was a new prof at Calvin, needing to lecture in U.S. history classes, and feeling woefully unprepared, and 3 new class preps that semester. And so we got to early 20th century. I thought, I know what I can do for this lecture. And I gave a little Gail Biederman-inspired lecture on Teddy Roosevelt, because I wanted to show my students at Calvin how my eyes had been opened to gender in history, that ideas of masculinity and femininity change over time, and that they're connected to things like economic shifts and to things like foreign policy and to race. And it had so changed the way I saw the world, because coming from a conservative Christian space, that's not how gender is talked about. Masculinity is God-ordained, it is static, it is traditional. And so I just wanted to shake up my students' worldviews just a little bit. And it was after that lecture that 2 guys from the class came up to me and said, "Professor Dumais, you have to read this book, Wild at Heart." And so I went down to Family Christian Bookstore. I still have the price tag on it, got the book and opened it up, and there's a quote from Teddy Roosevelt right up front. And so, yes, the influence of Biederman through and through, Joan Scott as well. And so I'm going to just jump into addressing some of the comments. I won't be able to catch them all, but maybe some of these issues we'll have a little bit more time. I know we'll have more time to get into. This kind of reader response, reception, negotiation, absolutely. When I'm asked by folks, scholars, grad students, what kind of work should be done next, or I just think of what work I really wanted to have available to me as I was writing this book, and that's more ethnographic studies. There's a little bit of that around the 1990s, the Promise Keepers movement, and I was able to incorporate that just a bit. But there's just that kind of detailed, on-the-ground work that needs to be done, and that I didn't have available to me, and I did not have the time on this deadline, as Matt knows, like to write this book. There was this looming deadline, and so I worked with what I had available to me. But what I can say is, since this book has come out, I've received so many hundreds of letters from readers, evangelicals, former evangelicals, well over 1,000 by now, probably considerably more, telling me their life stories and how they overlap with these readings, sending me pictures of their bookshelves that have every book that I discuss here, telling me how they did, first of all, there are some who say, oh yeah, I remember that book, had to read it, rolled my eyes, that was a joke, and went on, right? That's definitely part of, the 4 million people who read Wild at Heart, for example. And then there are hundreds that I've heard from who say, I absolutely fashioned my sex life around this advice. I formed my marriage around this, and it destroyed my marriage, or nearly destroyed my marriage, right? There's so many stories of how, in evangelical spaces in particular, these books are not just floating out there. They're not just entertainment, although they are that, but many of these books are read in small groups. And if you know if that phrase rings a bell, then you know. Right, small group Bible studies, church groups, and they are read as God speaking to you. And in this religious context. And so there are certainly people who kind of push this aside. I've heard from many people who entered into these spaces, who read this literature, embraced it, or many who said, I can't be this, I can't do this. And many who then decided that evangelicalism wasn't for them, that church wasn't for them, or Christianity wasn't for them. And so those are some glimpses I would like to incorporate more, or would like to have incorporated more. I actually have a lot more to work with now that the book has been out and has been read and engaged by so many folks. Let's see, the generational question, absolutely, since both brought this up. And here I'll talk about the title of the book too, Jesus and John Wayne. Yes, that was not my working title for the book. Was actually Onward Christian Warriors, and then I thought there are so many of the books themselves in this genre that have similar titles. I knew with a name like Kristin Kobus Dumais, that doesn't look like what it sounds like. It's utterly unsearchable. I knew I needed a very easy handle for this book. I knew I needed something to set it apart from Kingdom Warriors, and again, there's a lot in this genre of the actual books, and then I started to see how John Wayne kept popping up, and I thought, I think I can work with this, and so I just every time it popped up, I was like, okay, let me save that, let me put this in, and then see. When we got to making this decision, my editor wasn't convinced. He's like, there's a better title out there. I'm like, by all means, just tell me what it is, but tell me soon, because I need to pull out a few of these John Wayne references then. Now, if I could have called this book Jesus and Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, that's what I wanted. I just couldn't figure out how to make that work, because you're right, there is a real generational shift, and I was worried for precisely that reason. Like 17-year-olds, they don't all know who John Wayne is. Right, and I get that, and I knew that. That was a decision that I made, but I'm a historian. This is a work of history, and what I did like is how John Wayne roots this in history, roots it in the Cold War, roots this whole story, this masculinity in terms of pop culture, in terms of raises this question of what is secular, what is religious. And also in a way that I think makes race visible in that moment. And so I thought it worked for all those reasons. Essentially, the professor and me thought, if you can explain the title of this book, Jesus and John Wayne, right, you can explain the whole book. And so I went with that, but I was worried about that. The generation has changed, and so when I'm asked for hope for change, right, this book is depressing. And should we expect younger evangelicals to change? You can see survey data that younger evangelicals are parting ways on some issues, not on all. Now, the truth is we've had that kind of survey data for more than a generation, and then young evangelicals grow up to be old evangelicals, or they leave. And so I'm really cautious about suggesting that, yes, we are on the cusp of some major changes within evangelicalism. I don't think that we have the data to suggest that. Where I do go is precisely where Emily went. The evangelical subculture is nothing like it was 10 and 20 years ago, precisely because of the TikTok generation, precisely because, if you were an evangelical kid in the 1990s, it was very possible for you to be completely immersed in this world. It's very difficult, except in some of the more fringe homeschool circles, to be completely immersed in this culture. It doesn't function the same ways. We no longer have Christian bookstores for the most part. If you buy your Christian books on Amazon, right? So Lifeway Christian books has greatly diminished. The gatekeeping capacities, all of that has diminished. We are in a different space. The reception of this book as well. This book probably would not be sold at Family Christian Bookstore if it were still around. Obviously would not be sold there. But what this book has been able to do, and what Twitter has enabled, is we can now bypass some of these distribution networks, which are just lacking in the strength that they've once had anyway. And so there's so many things I want to cover here, so I'm thinking in the best order. I'll jump to the Twitter, the role of Twitter here. And audience. So the kind of life of this book, my intended audience, twofold, as the subtitle suggests. All Americans, right? Fractured a nation. I wanted to say this story has implications for all Americans. So that part, my audience, my publisher's primary audience for this book, anybody who reads the New York Times, right? I did not write this book primarily for evangelicals, but strong secondary audience and my heart audience. I think it's fair to say, yes. Evangelicals, people who knew this space. But I did not write the book in a way to cater to them. I did not write the book in a way to woo them. And so when this book released, it first met that primary audience, right? It was launched through Morning Edition on NPR. It made a splash there. It was doing well in those spaces. I knew I was going to have to work to get it into evangelical spaces. And then that's where Twitter came in, both Facebook and Twitter. And it was initially through word of mouth, facilitated by Twitter. I could see the conversations happening. I would retweet. People would follow me for those conversations. And it started to create this community and very much a distribution network. And then what happened is pastors got a hold of it and podcasters. And if there is a white male evangelical who does not have his own podcast today, I probably haven't met him. There are so many of these small podcasts. And so I thought, hey, yeah, you want me? Many conservative evangelical men would invite me on. And at first I was bracing myself like, okay, where's this going to? No, one after another, they were incredibly receptive. So they were pushing this book out into their spaces, often at some risk to themselves. I do know one person got fired for tweeting about this book. And then Beth Moore came along. So again, Twitter. Beth Moore, right, leading evangelical Bible study writer, evangelical heroine, who incredibly influential within evangelical spaces for decades. But most male evangelical leaders were largely oblivious to her power until social media made it plain. Right, she has 1 million followers on Twitter, and then she tweeted about this book, and that, I think, kind of opened the floodgates. Let evangelicals know that despite the subtitle, the corrupted of faith part, right? And that's not a historical claim. I want to be very clear. That is me speaking to evangelicals on their own terms. And that was the other audience. And to see them know, okay, despite all of this, despite those chapter titles, this book is for us. And so that's kind of the life of this book. Let me just see here. There's a lot of other substantive questions. Let me just quick talk about what is an evangelical. Yes, I did not set out to write a book of redefining evangelicalism at all. I initially just assumed I was going to drop in the Bebington quad in the intro somewhere and then go on and do whatever I was going to do, because that's what everybody seems to do. And then at a certain point I realized this does nothing for me. This is not getting at what I'm talking about here. But I want to push back a little bit on your framing that it's not theology. That quote you read, even, I say not chiefly defined by its theology. And that's not just me copping out here. It's theology does matter. And so I talk about, but you're also right, the order in which, which comes first? Does theology give cover to pre-existing political, cultural commitments? We see some fascinating evidence for that right now coming out of John Piper's orbit. In terms of response to racism, empathy is a sin, and so forth. And so you can see the theological edifices are there. Is theology really driving cultural engagement, or the other way around? And so here too, the CBMW, Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, a great example. I call it the theological think tank, and the SBC seminaries. Theology does matter because theology is helping to shape the what is produced in this consumer culture. There is a role there, but I don't think that evangelicalism is defined chiefly by its theology. And we have some survey data that it shows the high rates of theological illiteracy within evangelical spaces. And frankly, a lot of this comes from my own close observation of evangelical Bible studies, of my students coming from evangelical spaces, and what is really operative there. What makes someone identify as evangelical? Yes, I share that theological doctrine, or is it, yes, these are my people? Abortion, yes. And I would say abortion should have received more attention, and LGBTQ, right? Both of those. I was aware of that. I was looking for ways to give them more prominence. I would say I struggle with the question of the centrality of abortion. From my close observation, it is absolutely central to the politics of conservative evangelicalism when I hear people describe their views on abortion and how important it is to them. At the same time, I'm fairly certain that if you could wave a magic wand and abortion would just disappear, that the vast majority of conservative evangelicals would not shift their politics 1 inch, right? And so it's a kind of linchpin, maybe, I don't know if that's the best word, provides moral cover for a whole set of issues that come together. I do think that we can ask, the question that we need to ask is, why abortion, and why in this particular moment? Same thing on LGBTQ issues. And so what I do suggest is both of these issues did rise to the fore in the context of this fierce anti-feminism and assertion of patriarchal authority, and both of these issues threaten to undermine that. So that's, but much more could be said on both of those fronts. Also, the polling data is a little confusing here, because there are a number of polls that suggest when evangelicals are asked, in fact, to rank the importance of issues, abortion is shockingly low, beneath foreign policy, beneath economic policy, in a way that doesn't ring true to what I hear. So I don't quite know what to make of that. Let's see. Abuse, correlation, or causation. I was actually really careful with how I frame this, because there's evidence to suggest both. It is more prevalent or it is not. I went more qualitatively, and I was particularly concerned with the response within evangelical communities, the tendency to cover up, the language used to defend perpetrators, to blame victims, and this is, and also the experiences of victims themselves, of survivors who testify to being unable to identify abuse, to acknowledge, to push back because of these theological frameworks that they also were submitting to and thought were true. I'll wrap up my comments by talking about style. That's funny. I guess I should go into Goodreads. I'm not quite sure what people are saying about it on Goodreads. Why did I do that? I don't know. That's just the way the words came out. I knew. So one of the backdrop for this book is, when we're talking about social media, I started blogging after my first book came out, because Oxford asked me to. That was in the contract, actually. You have to write something for OUP blog. And so I wrote something, and I thought, okay, this is really fun. And I very quickly saw that more people read that one blog post than would ever read my book, right? So you could just grieve, or you could say, there's something here. And particularly for me, in that with my first book, I thought, there are evangelical women who need to read this book. These evangelical women, for the most part, don't read history books. Right? I know what they're reading. I see it, and it's not this. But they might read a blog post, and they might read a Facebook post. And so that's what I started doing, just to deliver some of this academic content that I thought was so important, to meet them where they were. And it worked. There is a huge appetite for good scholarship if it can be packaged in a way that is accessible. But I also know that our attention spans are dwindling. I feel it myself. And so when you blog, I blog knowing that every single paragraph, the reader is going to be tempted to click away. Every single paragraph. So you have to fight. You have to fight to keep them with you. And so I think I brought that style into this book. But then also I did want to, I resolved, having studied this culture, having immersed myself in this culture, I came to see how deference to authority characterized much of the last 50 years of American evangelicalism. Really struck me. And I saw some of the costs of that. And I knew I had that in me myself. And I resolved at some point I will not show deference to these authorities. And I'm going to make that very clear. And that's really where this tone came from. And to hold it up for all to see, to hold up the absurdity, the moral absurdity, in a way that that was powerful. So that's where I went with that. Do I have any regrets? Not at all. Not on those chapter titles. So I'll stop now. I think that's enough. I'm happy to pick up. I'm sure I missed some of these points, but thank you, and I look forward to the ongoing conversation.
Thank you so much to all three of you. Emily, that's exactly why I invited you. That is our practice at the Seminar on American Religion, to have, yes, we're all focused on religion, but we don't want to talk just to each other. And the genealogy you provided, the insight into consumer culture and gender was just so helpful. And Matt, too. I'm sorry you didn't get to write your book on this, but you're writing other things. I don't think Gail Biederman is here. Her name was on the list, and I wish she was, because it's so true what we all owe to her. I was in the exact same position as Kristin when I took my religious history classes here, but it was women's history that kind of blew my mind, and I thought there had to be a way to unite these two, and you've done it so well. I have to say, for me, when I remember when I first read this book, it wasn't badass or anything. It was the word wusses. You call someone wusses right in the first chapter, and I thought, wow, I have never heard that word in a scholarly book. That's what drew me in. There is a lot more to talk about, but it is our practice to take a short break right now. I should have mentioned, yes, this is, in addition to being our first post-COVID in-person gathering, it's also our first in this new building, and we're all disoriented. So the restrooms are just out that way. Please refresh your coffee, and we'll come back in about 10 minutes to open up the conversation. Thanks again.